And we have quite a few folks. All right, let's see who's got the recording going. So without further ado, I am going to introduce everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lynn Giacobbe. I'm the CEO of Kendal at Home. And the Kendal at Home course series is designed to educate, engage, and inform, and mostly entertain our guests as they join us for this fun presentation today. We hope that you, your family, and friends will find time to join us through the fall for many of the programs that we'll be offering. And most of them are virtual. Slowly, we're trying to get back to some in-person, but I think this opportunity to bring our folks together from Boston and the Cleveland area is one that we're able to do as a result of this technology. So we're grateful to have this opportunity. And I want to just recognize the Friends Foundation for the Aging for a generous contribution and grant that they've awarded us to continue this kind of programming for Kendal at Home that we offer to the community at large as well. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Ryan Anderson here in the Cleveland office with us, and Sue Whitkin, who's going to be helping us in the background here as well, and Paul Duffy, my colleague in Boston, and all of them will be helping as we co-host this program today. So as we just set up a little housekeeping for you, we're going to hear from Gordon and Jim this morning. And once they get through their presentation, we've allowed time for questions and comments and an opportunity to interact with them. So we encourage you to use the Q&A or the chat format to enter questions and comments. And we'll be monitoring that throughout and again, offering time for people to talk with them at the end. And you can raise your hand at the end and we can allow you to talk and ask your questions if you'd like. So whatever format you're comfortable with. You'll see the chat and the Q&A in the bar at the bottom or top, depending upon that. And you'll be able to interact and ask your questions. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure today to introduce journalist, historian, and a longtime supporter of the Jimmy Fund, Gordon Eads. So Gordon, it's great to have you here with us. And locally, I'm happy to introduce an award-winning sports columnist and author, Jim Ingraham, from the Chronicle Telegram. And they're going to talk about the baseball rivalry between the Boston Red Sox and the Cleveland Indians. So enjoy.
Lynn, thank you so much. And off the top, I want to tell folks, don't be intimidated by Jim's stern look right now. He's actually one of the funniest guys I've ever shared a press box with. Great sense of humor. And it's funny, Jim, when I've spoken to shared baseball audiences, oftentimes it's been, as you well imagine, Boston and New York. So it's kind of cool that on this occasion, it is fans of the Red Sox and Cleveland Indians. It's pretty remarkable how much shared history there is between the two teams. I suppose not, given they're both the original American League franchise. It's a bad rumor, Jim, that you had the first exclusive with Napoleon Lajoie, and I had the first exclusive with who? I don't know, Babe Ruth? No, it's not true. Yes, we both spent a lot of years covering baseball, but of the 266 players, according to Baseball Reference, Jim, that have played for both the Red Sox and Indians, we've only personally covered a fraction of those. But Jim, welcome to be a part of this, and I guess we won't go back to the very early years just yet, because you and I shared a lot of time, a lot of experience covering a guy who did play for both teams, and that, of course, is Manny Ramirez. Why don't you take us through Manny, the early years in Cleveland?
Well, how long have we got? Manny, I have to say, I covered the Indians as a beat writer for close to 30 years, maybe a little more than that. He was the most interesting character I've ever come across, and on all those Cleveland teams. We really didn't know much about him. I mean, when he got drafted, it was 1991, I believe, and he was, in that Lin-Manuel's new movie on The Heights, that's where Manny was from, that part of New York. And the Indians scouting director then was Mickey White, and he found Manny in the heart of New York City, which you can't imagine how much baseball could be played there, much less really good baseball, but there is a lot of that. And he found Manny Ramirez and drafted him in with the 13th pick of the first round of the 91 draft. And, as you know, Gordy, in those days, there was always a question of signability, because, a lot of these kids can, see what the team is offering, or they can decide to go to college and go back in the draft 3 years later. So, it was almost an automatic question on the day of the draft when they'd hook you up with the players, the first round picks high school coach, and which they did in our case with Manny's high school coach. And he was asked, what do you think Manny's signability will be, or is he going to sign with the Indians? And the coach said, well, he is looking at some colleges. There was a brief moment of chuckling, and so obviously Manny did not go to college. He signed with the Indians, and he's almost like a hitting savant, I would describe him. I mean, there was I remember the first spring he got to the Indians training camp, in the minor league camp. Charlie Manuel was the hitting coach on the major league team, and he told all the minor league staff, don't do a thing don't you dare tamper with this swing. Don't change anything. Just let him alone, let him hit. And he just tore through the minor league system. I mean, as you know.
Let me interrupt you there. I wonder if, given the way teams are treating their young hitters now in the minor leagues, and adjusting everything with, to launch angle and based on the analytics. Mm-hmm. Do you think they would have been messing with Manny's swing today?
I think Manny would skip that course, and he probably wouldn't even have needed it, because he was the all-time classic see the ball, hit the ball guy, and he could see it better and hit it better than just about anyone. So Charlie told everyone to just leave him alone, and he went through the Indians minor league system really fast. I mean, he had a 100 RBI season in a minor league season, which is very rare, if not impossible. But he coincided, his arrival coincided with the opening of what was then Jacobs Field, and the last right fielder before Manny was Wayne Kirby, and there was actually some debate when Manny was ready for the big leagues. Mike Hargrove, the manager at the time, really liked Kirby a lot. He was like one of those classic overachievers, a team guy and all that. But when they saw Manny swing the bat and all the stuff he could do, he obviously was the one that deserved to play. And then so he broke in, I believe it was a 93 season, I think was his first year. And that's when the legend began. I mean, it was almost a daily thing about, did you hear about Manny, what he did this time or this time? And he was just one of those guys that was literally born to play baseball and to hit a baseball mainly. But there was all kinds of other antics that we heard about. For example, I think it was his first month in the big leagues. Someone had to go get something out of his car, and they noticed his glove box was open and all of his paychecks were in the box. And he had not cashed any of them because he didn't realize that, well, that's your paycheck. That's, you got to take those to the bank. And so that was one of them. And he was just his favorite. He didn't know anybody's name, even after 5 years on the team. All he would ever say to, especially the media, would be just, "How's it going, big guy?" Everyone was big guy. "How's it going, big guy?" But he was the only guy I ever saw that stole second and then stole first because he thought it was a foul ball. So that was another highlight on one of those one of the games.
Did he make it back to first safely, Jim?
He did, because I can't remember what team it was. They were like so taken aback by this maneuver that they just kind of stood there and watched him. And so he ran to second and then back to first. I think they only gave him credit for one steal on that one. There was another time in Houston where he was playing right field, and someone hit a ball down the line into the bullpen where the benches were. And Manny was convinced that he knew the rule on this, that if it went under the bench, it was a dead ball, and he was completely wrong. So everyone in the infield is screaming to him to go get the ball, go get the ball. And he's shaking his hand and saying, no, everything's fine. It's a foul ball. And I forget who the hitter was, but I think he got a triple out of what should have been no more than a double or maybe a single, until someone convinced Manny to go pick up the ball and throw it into the infield. But, you know, all that kind of stuff was just kind of forgotten when he was in the batter's box, because as you saw as much as I did, maybe the best right-handed hitter of our era of covering baseball. There was no pitcher he couldn't hit, and he just made hitting look so easy that he was a lot of fun to watch as a hitter, and a lot of entertainment in the other parts of his time in Cleveland.
You know, Jim, I would readily concur with your characterization of Manny as a hitting savant. That said, he spent, at least when he in his Boston years, and I presume this was the case in Cleveland, he spent a tremendous amount of time working on his hitting, studying hitting, watching video. I mean, he'd be a guy who'd be in the clubhouse by 9 o'clock in the morning for a 7 o'clock game. He'd maybe watch some video, lift some weights, and go home and come back later. But certainly as much natural ability as there was there, he's a guy who took what he had and essentially perfected it. Would you concur?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Charlie Manuel helped him a lot. Charlie was a terrific hitting coach. And you're right about the video part of it. I mean, when he got to the big leagues, that was just about when video stuff was really starting to get some traction. And he would come in and look at the pitcher for that day. He would be, many times I'd go into the clubhouse and they would always put a tape of the pitcher of that night's pitcher on the TV so the players could see what he threw and everything. And he was consistently always in front of the TV for a good bit of time, just watching what the pitcher would throw. And he was in that regard a student of the game, or a student of hitting at least. And I'm sure that helped him. But when you just talk about just natural ability, I mean, when a guy like Charlie Manuel says, "Don't anybody touch this guy's swing," from the moment he walked onto the spring training field, tells you, you know, how there wasn't much to improve upon with Manny. It was just a matter of him getting the experience, and then you just turned him loose and enjoyed the show.
You know, one of my most vivid memories of Manny in the Cleveland uniform, I believe it came in the '98 playoffs against the Red Sox, and he hit a home run off Eck. And I remember the TV cameras catching Dennis Eckersley just going, wow, you know,
yeah.
because it was an epic blast. And I'm correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but was that the season that Manny drove in 165 runs?
That might have been. I think that was the year before he joined you guys. I think that was his
Oh, in '99. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was the thing about Manny. Pitchers could make the exact pitch they wanted to make, and he would hit it 400 feet. And it was like, you know, how do you pitch to a guy like that? And he had that smooth stroke. The thing about Manny, I also remember a lot about is, and I thought this about a lot of really good hitters, but especially him. He never got mad at an umpire on a called strike. Like, and I got to feel that the reason for that was he was such a great hitter. One strike didn't matter to him. I mean, you know, most big league hitters, an average big league hitter, you know, they'll argue about a strike because you only get 3 of them. And if one gets taken away from you, you get really upset. But Manny would, you know, you'd see a bad call by an umpire on a called strike, and Manny wouldn't even blink. He'd just, you know, get back in and hit the next ball on a line drive into the gap somewhere. So he was so sure of himself and so confident, and he never really got into arguments with umpires at all, unlike one of the other hitters in the lineup with him that usually hit right behind him. But yeah, he was really a lot of fun to watch, and I just feel bad about the fact that you know, he started dabbling in PEDs, and it's going to cost him a spot in the Hall of Fame, which he otherwise richly deserves. One quick more thing about him, Gordy. When I was doing this book on Mike Hargrove, he has a bunch of memorabilia in his basement, but he's only got 2 lineup cards, and the 2 lineup cards are, one of them is because Manny and Jim Thome came up just about at the same time. one of those lineup cards is Manny batting eighth and Tommy batting ninth, and the other one is Tommy batting eighth and Manny batting ninth. And that was like right on the cusp of those powerhouse Indians teams. And he wanted to keep those. Hargrove did those two lineup cards. There's like 1,000 home runs there from those two guys, and they're batting eighth and ninth in that lineup.
Yeah, not your usual 8 and 9 hole hitters. So, so where Red Sox and Indians history dovetail when it comes to Manny, maybe most memorably, is the winter meetings of 2000. Manny's a free agent, and his agent, Jeff Morad, did a very unusual thing. He allowed TV cameras essentially to chart and record for posterity his negotiations, a lot of them, and particularly with Dan Duquette and the Red Sox. And the Red Sox strike this $160 million deal for Manny, 8 seasons, $160 million, which trumped the Indians offer. But they think they have the deal in place. The Red Sox think they have Manny. The agent, Jeff Morad, thinks he has Manny's going to Boston. And then he gets a phone call from Manny. And Manny says, I'm not going to Boston unless Frankie Mancini comes with me. Jim, would you care to enlighten our audience who Frankie Mancini is?
Frankie Mancini was the senior clubhouse assistant for the Indians throughout all the Manny years, and really for probably 30 years total on either side of that. And he was Manny's valet, gopher guy, whatever Manny needed, Frankie would take care of him. And he was kind of like just the guy, whenever Manny needed something done, Frankie would do it for him. And they got along really well. Frankie, there were frequently, we would go to Frankie for quotes on just what's going on with Manny, because Manny wouldn't really want to talk too much about things, but Frankie would keep us all up to date on all of the printable stuff about Manny that was interesting. And yeah, you're right. Manny wanted him with him wherever he was going.
Yeah, and so ultimately, Manny was persuaded to come to Boston even without Frank Mancini. And Frank, who was also, a confidant, a prayer partner with Manny, it boosted him. He said Manny was very insecure, which is hard to believe about such a great hitter. But Frank did say he worried a little bit about Manny going to Boston because it's such a different market than Cleveland. And certainly Manny, though he performed at an extraordinary level in Boston and was such a key component to those championship teams, I mean, he was a mixed bag. I mean, it's hard to believe, but in 2003, after the 2003 season, Theo Epstein, the Red Sox general manager at the time, put Manny on irrevocable waivers after the season, which meant that any team could have had Manny for the waiver price of, I think at the time, Jim, was $20,000.
Yeah.
You had occasion to talk to Manny through the Boston years. Did you sense that wasn't a particularly good fit for him?
It's funny you mentioned that, because when he signed with Boston initially, the writers in Cleveland, generally the consensus was that would be like the worst place we would think Manny should go, because Boston is so baseball crazy and Manny is so la-di-da about the baseball that it seemed like not a real good mix there. And we wondered if he would just kind of get eaten alive by the intensity up there of the fans and the games and everything. And obviously it didn't affect him at all. But on the surface, at least to us, we thought, if he's going to go somewhere like that, I mean, New York and Boston would probably be the least good fit for him at that time in his life. But as most things in Manny's life, his astonishing ability to hit overrode everything, and it didn't matter what else happened, he could always hit, and for that reason, he could be a good fit on any team, really.
And it worked well in Boston almost through the life of that contract. He did kind of force his way out of town at the trading deadline in 2008 when the Red Sox traded him to the Dodgers. That's when they memorably, Jim, sent Manny to get MRIs on both knees because Manny wasn't sure which one was hurting. So I'm sure that doesn't shock you. And then, of course, Manny goes to LA and has a tremendous second half of the season for the Dodgers. They changed the Hollywood sign to the Mannywood sign in LA, at least figuratively. He has expressed regret about some of the things he did in Boston, but there was a love affair between the fans of Boston with Manny. I think for a lot of fans, they were willing to forgive any transgression whatsoever because of what the man did in the batter's box. And he also, in the field, gave us such memorable moments as cutting off Johnny Damon's throw from center field. And
remember that.
The first time a left fielder has acted as a cutoff man in baseball history. But, you know, Jim, I'm going to leave it here because we could spend this whole hour just talking about Manny. I'll tell you one Manny story that I hadn't heard until I read Michael Silverman's book on Pedro. And this took place in the 2004 ALCS after the Red Sox had lost the first 3 games to the Yankees. I think the story is well known that Kevin Millar had passed around little sips of Jack Daniels and all of that. But Manny, his wife was from Brazil, and a friend had given him a jug that was filled with bark and twigs and leaves from the rainforest of Brazil. And then you were supposed to fill it with, you know, a beverage of your choice. In this case, Manny put some gin in there. He put some red wine in there. He put some honey in there. He ground up, let's say, some male enhancement medication, put that in there, let it steep, and called upon Ellis Burks, who was the senior statesman on the team at that time, and a guy who had played in Cleveland as well, and had Ellis take the first sip. And a couple minutes later, Ellis says, "Man, this stuff works." So everybody on the team took a little sip. As the Red Sox fans in the audience know, they went on to stage the greatest comeback in baseball history, winning 4 straight against the Yankees. They never lost again in that postseason. It was called Mama Juana, coming to neighborhood grocery shelves soon. So that's my last Manny story for this session. So I think it would be appropriate to talk about another outfielder, Jim. And this is going back into the early years of both franchises, a Hall of Famer by the name of Tris Speaker. Tris Speaker really needs no introduction. I mean, his lifetime batting average of .345 was a point higher than Ted Williams. So that gives you some sense of the caliber of player we're talking about. And in 1915, he was in the prime of his career. He leads the Red Sox to the World Series. They had won in 1912 as well. Season's over, and the owner of the Red Sox, a guy by the name of Joseph Lannon, sends Speaker a contract for the 2016 season. He wanted to cut his salary by $5,000, from $14,000 to $9,000. The reason being that the Federal League had come into existence, a rival league had come into existence in 2014. They had come after its Speaker. So to keep him from jumping leagues, Lannon had paid him, had given him a big raise. Well, the Federal League folds, and Lannon wants to cut Speaker's salary. And Speaker says, no way. So in essence, he becomes a holdout. Toward the end of spring training, he goes on a barnstorming tour with the rest of the club as they're playing exhibitions. Right on the eve of the regular season, he hits a game-winning home run against Rube Marquardt. And Lannon calls him in his hotel room and says, "Speak, your terms are acceptable to us. We're going to get this done." Well, that night, he also gets a phone call. And this part of the story, Jim, you'll deeply appreciate, I think, because evidently a sports writer, according to the telling in Cleveland, played a big role in Tris Speaker winding up with the Indians. A sports writer by the name of Ed Bang, and this is, of course, pre-internet, pre-24/7 news coverage.
Yeah.
Ed Bang had come across a story that the Red Sox were looking to possibly trade Speaker. So he calls up Bob McRae, who was the general manager of the Indians at that time, and says, look, I think notice the royal we in the usage here. I think we could get Tris Speaker. You ought to call Lannon. And sure enough, the owner of the team, Jim Dunn, calls Lannon. Lannon makes a deal for Speaker, sells him for $55,000, which was at the time the most money ever included in a deal per player. A couple other players were involved in the deal, including a pitcher named Sam Jones. And that night, McRoy, the GM, calls Speaker and asks him if he'd come down to the lobby to meet with him. And McRoy informs him that he's just been sold to the Indians. And Speaker says, no way. And initially he balked. He wasn't going to come. He wanted the Red Sox to throw in $10,000 of that $55,000 they had gotten for him. He wanted them to pay that to him as a bonus. Now there's diverging stories on this. One story is that he eventually settled for a lesser amount. The other story is that Van Johnson, who was the president of the American League at the time, and damn the conflicts of interest, also had a financial stake in the Cleveland team, persuaded Lannon to give him the $10,000. In any event, Speaker ends up with the Indians. Jim, take us through the rest of the story.
Yeah, he arrived at the perfect time, and you're right, he was at the peak of his career, which was quite a career. And he was here maybe a year or two, and then he became the player manager from center field, no less, which I always found interesting. And yeah, he just didn't really miss much of a beat in Cleveland. In fact, in 1920, then eventually he was the manager and star player of the Indians team that won their first World Series, and one of only two to this day that they've won.
When you said first World Series, Jim, I was thinking, okay, Jim, how many do you think there have been,
Yeah. Well, they don't like to overdo it. They dip their toe in the water there and see if they like that or not, I guess.
And Red Sox fans like to cry poor and say they've had it rough, but the reality is, I mean, the Tribe, as you know, 2 World Series in the span of what? We're going on 120, 121 seasons now.
Yeah. And they haven't had, their last one was in 48. So you need a calculator to keep track of how many years it's been with these guys. But Speaker was really the driving force on that 1920 team, which, as you know, had the unbelievable misfortune in August of that year of Ray Chapman getting hit in the head by Carl Mays and being killed on the field. And that Speaker was very close to Chapman. In fact, he was in the on-deck circle when Chapman got hit, and he was the first one that got there. And he knew Chapman's wife took the next train to New York. This happened at the Polo Grounds, and he got her at the train and took her to the hospital and everything. But he was really broken up by the whole thing, and reportedly had a nervous breakdown during the funeral. They suspended. I think the Indians they gave him like 2 days off to handle this tragedy before they had to go back to playing baseball again. And gee, if there was ever an event that you would think would derail a team from, a first place team from continuing on at the success rate they were having, that would be the event that would do it. But apparently that became a rallying point for the team, and they ended up winning the pennant and then beating the Brooklyn Robins, I believe it was, in the World Series. And that was back when it was a 9-game series, and they won 5-2, and the first and one of only 2 World Series championships by the Indians. But yeah, Speaker he stayed through most of the rest of his peak of his career in Cleveland, and holds, if you look in the Cleveland Indians record book, he's like all over the place as far as hitting. And he was really big on getting double plays from center field too. He'd play real shallow and get unassisted double plays. He'd catch a sinking liner and run in and step on second base and that kind of thing. I do know after he retired, he stayed in Cleveland and was for a time the boxing commissioner in the city of Cleveland. So that was another, and he always he still stayed connected with the team for several years after he retired. But yeah, he was when you talk about, the all-time Indians teams, Lajoie and Speaker are right near the top of the list.
There's one other subplot to the Speaker story that played a significant role in him leaving Boston, but also played a significant role in the Indians winning in 1948. So the Red Sox clubhouse in the early teens were split on religious lines. Tris Speaker was a Texan and Protestant and very anti-Catholic at the time. And the other two stars of that Red Sox outfield, Harry Hooper and Duffy Lewis, were both Catholics. And for a couple of years, they wouldn't even speak to Speaker. And so there was kind of a poisonous environment there. And it was also suggested that Speaker belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Well, let's fast forward to 1947, I believe, or late in 47, the Indians signed Larry Doby, correct? Who becomes the first African-American player to play in the American League. And Bill Beck, the owner of the club, hires Tris Speaker to school Doby in playing center field. Well, the two men became so close that when Doby retired and they held a parade in his honor, Doby had Tris Speaker ride alongside him in the convertible in that parade. So I think it's notable mentioning that. And there are two center fielders in Cleveland history that are in the Hall of Fame, Jim, that are wearing Cleveland baseball caps, and they're Tris Speaker and Larry Doby.
Yeah, that's a good story, and they both were deservedly so. I mean, Doby, in fact, still to this day doesn't, I don't think, get as much credit or notice for being the first African American in the American League, and Jackie Robinson, rightfully so, is the focal point every year with that. But Doby went through just as much as Jackie did, and in some ways it was even harder because Robinson, I think didn't he join them at the beginning of a season? I think Jackie Robinson and Doby just joined the Indians cold from Newark, New Jersey. He came to Chicago, and it was like in May or June, and he walked into a clubhouse, didn't know anybody, and got the expected cold treatment from a lot of those players. And but eventually, when everyone saw how he could hit, and he was accepted, it took a while, and he ended up having a really, even though he got a late start, but he had a really tremendous career with the Indians.
Yeah. There's certainly one story about the Cleveland-Boston rivalry that I'm sure our audience, especially those who are as seasoned as we are or more, would love to hear. And that's the story of the famous 1948 playoff game where the Indians and the Red Sox ended the regular season tied for first place in the American League. There was a one-game playoff in Fenway Park, and the pitcher chosen unexpectedly by the Red Sox manager, Joe McCarthy, was an Ohio native, Denny Galehouse, born in Marshalltown, grew up in Doylestown. Am I getting that right? Doylestown?
Yeah.
Doylestown. He was known as the pride of Doylestown. Galehouse actually had 2 tours of duty with the Red Sox. Cleveland and he had played for the Indians. Cleveland had traded him in 1938 to the Red Sox for Ben Chapman. The Sox later sold him to the St. Louis Browns, where Galehouse ended up being a bit of a World Series hero in 1944, beating the Cardinals in one game. They ultimately lost that World Series, but Galehouse pitched very well. But by 1948, he certainly had been eclipsed in the Red Sox rotation by other guys like Mel Parnell, for example, and Ellis Kinder, both of whom were available to pitch that game. Parnell would have been going on 3 days rest, and Kinder had won 4 of his last 5 starts and also was well rested. Parnell has said repeatedly that he expected to pitch that game. Well, Denny Galehouse shows up at the ballpark the next day and finds the ball, game ball in his glove, which was McCarthy's way of letting the pitcher know who was going to start. Well, he gives up a home run in the first inning to Boudreaux, gives up a 3-run homer to Keltner in the 4th. Kenny Keltner, the third baseman. The Indians go on to win 8-3, which they used as then the springboard to winning that World Series in 48. But that has become, maybe as much as the Grady Little, why did you leave Pedro in Game 7 in 2003? Galehouse, the decision to pitch Galehouse kind of dogged McCarthy, and they released Galehouse the following year, and he was out of baseball 2 years later. But what's interesting, Jim, is it's almost one of those stories that has gained steam many years afterward. It wasn't that big an issue at the time, but when Dan Shaughnessy included it in his Curse of the Bambino book, well, then all of a sudden, there was it was part of that here's why the Red Sox haven't won a World Series in 86 years.
It's funny, when I started covering baseball and coming to Boston regularly, we would always read in the papers from you guys, there'd be just these casual mentions of Denny Galehouse, and it wasn't really, we didn't really know the backstory to it, but we'd always look at each other and go, what's with Denny Galehouse up here? It's like, what happened there? And we finally found out what it was all about, but boy, they didn't, you're right, it's talked about, I presume, up there, like it was last year's World Series that got screwed up or something.
Yeah. Since we're in the 40s, we should talk about 2 of the greats, one for Cleveland and one for the Red Sox, both Hall of Famers, both war heroes. Bob Feller on your side, Jim, and of course, Ted Williams on our side, on the Red Sox side. And Ted, the most home runs Feller gave up in his career were 11 to any player, and that was Joe DiMaggio. Well, Ted was next with 10, and Ted hit 344 lifetime against Feller, but he said that Feller was the greatest pitcher he ever faced, and that typically he'd start thinking about the next day's pitcher the night before. He said when he knew Feller was going to be pitching, he'd started thinking about him 3 days earlier.
Yeah.
And in terms of their war record, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Feller enlists in the U.S. Navy, ends up seeing all kinds of action as, I believe, an anti-aircraft gunner in the Pacific. He was very proud of his war service. He could have been deferred and ignored his deferment, goes in. Ted, interestingly enough, actually exercised his deferment initially to go into World War II, caught a lot of flack publicly, played the 1942 season, and then enlisted, spent 3 years as a flight instructor, did not see combat in World War II, but then was called back into service during the Korean War and flew 38 combat missions, and served as wingman to John Glenn, another famous Ohioan.
Oh, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the, if I could go back in a time machine to see a Feller, Ted Williams, 4 at-bats of Williams against Feller in any game, that must have been something to watch. I mean, like the guy that maybe the all-time greatest hitter and one of the all-time greatest pitchers, and it had to have been real. I don't think the concession stands did much business then when those two were facing each other.
No, And I'm looking at the time, and I invite our audience, if you have a question, you can go to your bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A function. There's also a chat function. Jim, we have to talk. We got to jump. I know we've been doing a lot of jumping around here, but we got to go to 1999 playoff series, American League Division Series, Cleveland, Boston, second inning of game one. Pedro Martinez, speaking of all-time greats, feels something between a pinch and a pull while pitching to Jim Thome. Ends up hurting his lat muscle. He said it was some of the most excruciating pain he'd ever felt in his career. Everybody thinks he's done for the series. We go down to the decisive game 5. Brett Saberhagen starts it for the Red Sox. The Indians had that powerhouse lineup. They're ahead 8-7 after 3 innings. And who goes down to the bullpen at the top of the 4th but Pedro Martinez? And then he comes out of the pen. He doesn't have his fastball. And for the next 6 innings, proceeds to no-hit that powerhouse Cleveland Indians team. Yeah. What do you remember about that game, Jim?
When I was talking to Hargrove about that series for my book, he said when the off day in Boston, they went out to eat, and he ran into Joe Kerrigan, the Red Sox pitching coach at the time, and they exchanged highs and everything. And because Pedro had that condition, and Hargrove just said, "Oh, he asked Kerrigan, how you doing?" He goes, "Well, I'm doing okay, but I don't think Pedro's going to be able to play. He's probably done for the series." And so Hargrove didn't even think about him as a factor in the rest of the series until that game when they brought him in. And you're right. I think the score was 8-8 or 8-7 in the 3rd inning, and then they brought Pedro in, and the game was over. I mean, they couldn't even. I don't think they didn't get a hit. They barely had anybody on base, and it was just Hargrove said that's the best he'd ever seen Pedro ever. He goes, and the thing about Pedro, he said that Pedro would do stuff like he would just throw nothing but fastballs for one whole trip to the lineup. And then the second time through the line, maybe he would throw all curveballs, and just, it was almost like pitching was too easy for him. He could get you out in so many different ways.
But on this occasion, Pedro didn't have a fastball.
Yeah.
He was relying on his changeup and his curveball, but he said after that. I'm sorry, Jim?
And his reputation. One was a fast, 2 was a curve, 3 was a slider, and 4 was his reputation.
Yeah. And that I'm glad you mentioned that, because reputation in the place a pitcher occupies in a hitter's head winds up playing a significant role in winning and losing, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I agree. Yeah. Especially Pedro had that swagger about him, and of course he backed it up all the time. So, that was the last pitcher they wanted to see coming out of the bullpen in that game for the Indians in that game.
I'm looking at the time. We got a little bit more time, I think, to continue our discussion. Then we'll go to the question. So 2007, it looks like the Indians have the Red Sox number. They're up 3-1. They're playing great baseball. Their game 5 is in the Jake. They've invited Josh Beckett, who was the Red Sox ace at the time. The Indians line up Josh Beckett's ex-girlfriend to sing the anthem before that game. Talk about gamesmanship. And what happens, Jim?
Yeah. Well, what happens is the Indians ace wasn't Pedro Martinez that game. I mean, they had it all. That's the one that really bugs me the most. They had it all set up. You're right. They were up 3-1. They needed one more win. They had CC Sabathia, who was a Cy Young winner a couple years prior to that, ready to go on his home field. All they had to do was win one game. And if you remember, no offense to the Colorado Rockies, but I think everyone considered whoever was going to come out of the AL was going to win the World Series. And it just was teed up perfectly for the Indians. And CC, they just couldn't close the deal. And then they went back up to Boston and got beat twice in a row. 23-7 was one of the scores when Bartolo Colon started. And then and then they came home and the Red Sox beat them again and won the pennant. And then it was after that game that the clinching game, because Hargrove was worried about they've been to 5 postseasons in a row, but they were never able to win a World Series. And he was starting to think he was a little bit on shaky ground with John Hart, the manager, and all that. So when the Red Sox came back and won those 3 games and eliminated them in ’99, after the game, Sharon Hargrove, Mike's wife, took the kids. They had 5 kids. They were all young at the time. And they went down to his office after the game, and he was in taking a shower, and Sharon brought the kids into his office and said, "Take a good look around, kids. This isn't going to be Daddy's office anymore."
Oh, that's brutal.
And she said she knew it. She really felt it, but then she said, then she walked out into the tunnel to leave and walked by John Hart, and John Hart didn't even acknowledge her. And just, that's when she said she knew that the run was over, and they were right. Like a month later, they changed managers.
Yeah. So Jim, the anthem singer story, is that a true story or is that apocryphal?
No, I remember that. And I remember, yeah, that created quite a furor over there. Like, I mean, how would you even think to do that? Whoever thought that up, I mean, even though it was a little bit tacky, it certainly was creative, I would say. And hey, when you've only been to 2 World Series in a century, you pull out all the stops when you're close.
You know,
Hey guys, I'm going to interject with a couple comments. First of all, we have someone in our audience who snuck into the 7th game of the 48 World Series. So I don't know, there might be a story there. We'd have to invite in there.
Yeah, Lynn, you know, I saw that and, you know, by all means, if he wants to share that story with us, I want to hear this.
Okay. And while I'm going to allow him to speak, that's Stuart. I'm also going to, just a question here. Can you talk about Louis Tiant's career with both the Indians and the Red Sox?
That's a, you know, while Stuart, while you're putting your memories together, Jim, let's talk about El Tiante, because
Yeah.
I mean, in essence, he had 2 different careers. I mean, he was one kind of pitcher with the Indians in the 60s. And then by the time the Red Sox got him, it looked like he was washed up, and he ends up having this amazing renaissance and becomes El Tiante. But tell us a little bit about those Cleveland years.
Well, he was one of those guys that just kind of appeared on the roster in the early 60s. And, you know, you could tell he was pretty good, and he kept getting better and better. And he would strike out. He had like big strikeout totals. I remember being at a game there as a kid, and I think he struck out like 18, 19 or 20 Twins in a 13-inning game or something. And the 68 team, they had Sam McDowell, who was another big time strikeout guy, and Tiant were the 1-2 punch, and they were like almost unbeatable on those 2 days. And Tiant was just, you know, he wasn't very colorful like he was when he was with Boston, because he was kind of establishing himself in the major league level. But boy, I mean, the teams couldn't touch him. I think Sam and him both had ERAs well under 2. Of course, that was the dead ball era, whatever you want to call it, of the 60s. But they were both really good. And Louis was just like, he would just keep pitching until the game was over. If it went 10, 11, 12 innings, it didn't matter to him. He just kept throwing. And that was another trade, if I recall, that didn't go the Indians' way too well when you guys got Tiant.
So
All right, so
Tiante,
I've got Stuart on there if he wants to share his story.
yeah, Lynn, Stuart, I'm begging for a little more patience. Let me wrap up El Tiante and then jump in, my friend, because we are eager to hear this. But El Tiante in 68 had a 1.60 ERA. He led the American League, was amazing. He had the misfortune of pitching in a year that Denny McLain won 31 games. So McLain wins the Cy Young Award. But by the time he got to the Red Sox, he'd been released by the Twins, he'd been released by the Braves. He pitched in minor league for the AAA Red Sox, and they call him up. His first year with the Red Sox, he was 0-7. But then he got his health back. He became the magician on the mound with the man of 1,000 pitching movements, windups. you know, with the hesitation and all of that, and became then, you know, the guy that the slayer of the big red machine, at least in game one, a shutout when he shut out the Reds in the 75 World Series in game one. And then the game that I regard as maybe his greatest game, I think he threw in the neighborhood of 160 pitches against the Reds in that World Series and won game 4, 5-4 in an epic game. But we love El Tianti. I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. Stuart, the stage is yours. Tell us about sneaking in to game 7 of the 48 World Series. And I presume you're talking Indians and Boston Braves.
Yes, I don't know whether you can see this.
Am
I on a camera or not?
You're not
no,
at the
but
moment.
I might be able to bring you in. Hang on. Let me see if I can do that.
In the meantime, Stuart, were you arrested for sneaking into that game, or did you avoid law enforcement?
Okay. So I don't know if you're gonna get the picture. I see my name there.
Do you have your camera on?
Well, who knows? I thought so. Oh, I have to say, start my video.
That
There
might
you
work.
go. There you go.
Oh, there he is.
Oh my gosh. So
Beautiful. We can see that
Oh my
very
gosh.
clearly.
Oh, that is so cool.
I just moved and I uncovered my pennant from the great 48 year.
How about that, Stuart? So tell us the story. How old were you, and what do you remember of that game?
I was 12 years old. And during that season, I turned styles to get into the Indians games. And when it came time for the World Series, there were no positions available at the styles. So there was a concession gate. And while a concessionaire was unloading, I managed to get by and ran into the stadium. I knew the stadium upside and backwards because having been all over the stadium after turning styles, we don't have seats, so we went everywhere.
Stuart, excuse me for interrupting, but do you happen to recall how much they paid you for turning styles in 1948?
Free passage to a ball game.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, free labor, in other words.
So you couldn't, usually you could, to a regular ball game, you could find a place, you could usually find a seat somewhere. But of course, in the 48 World Series, you couldn't even, because it was standing room only. And I couldn't force myself up into the back of the stadiums. I watched the game on the riser, the ramp, where you could barely see the field.
And that's, were there upwards of 80,000 people there?
Yes.
You're talking about the old municipal stadium.
That was set the record for any major league game.
Yeah.
You didn't mention who pitched for Boston, who pitched for Cleveland in the 48 Boston playoff.
The knuckleballer, Gene
Bearden. He was my hero.
All right. Well, let's give him his props then. So, hey, Stuart, do you remember anything from that game 7? Do you remember how the team celebrated? Any memories stand out from that game?
I can't. I was just so excited to be a part of that scene that I cannot remember it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that pennant with us and that memory. And it's a pretty cool, that was a good summer, 1940. Jim, think about it. 12 years old, that's the wheelhouse of being a sports fan. And here he's getting 3 passes to see the last team to win a Cleveland World Series. So thank you for sharing, Stuart.
Our parents allowed us to take the bus downtown on our own at 12 years old in the city and make our way. It was really a different world then.
Yeah, it was. But thank you for sharing. Lynn, are there other questions?
There is another question, and I will say that, as a Cleveland fan, we are hoping that someday we'll get to see that World Series again here. According to my recollection, Bertie Tebbetts told McCarthy that Parnell and Kinder both had reasons not to take the ball. Also, Ted thought Herb Score and his slider made him among the toughest to hit. Of course, his career was affected by the injury after the McDougal line drive.
Yeah. You know, Lynn, that is a story in 1989, in an interview that Denny Galehouse did. He told that story that McCarthy had asked the player to go around and ask the other pitchers who were candidates to pitch in that game. And according to Galehouse, they all had a little reason that they gave for why they couldn't pitch. Now, Parnell and Kinder would dispute that story vigorously. Bertie Tebbetts later acknowledged that, yes, he was the guy that McCarthy had asked to go around. But Bertie said, I'm never going to tell you what those guys said until I write my book. And I guess he never gotten around to writing that chapter because we've never heard that story. And of course, you mentioned Herb Score, the great Indians pitcher and later broadcaster, correct? Who was one of the hardest throwing pitchers in baseball history and did have the killer slider as well. And you know, Jim, my question for you is and certainly a guy that has a lot of shared history in both Boston and Cleveland is Terry Francona, the manager of the Red Sox, who broke the curse in Boston, managing in 2004 and 7 World Series, leaves after the 11 collapse when the Red Sox went 7-20 in September, gets scooped up by the Indians and becomes pretty much a beloved character in Cleveland, the only moped riding manager in baseball that I know of. Tito's had significant health issues. Jim, where do things stand with that?
Well, he's had the hip replacement. He had that done about a month ago, I think. And when that fully heals, then he has to have a rod put into his right leg, I believe it is, to address a staph infection that he had last off season. And he has to stay off his feet for like 10 weeks after that surgery. So he's got one behind him, but the next one's going to be a little bit of a longer recovery time. And they're kind of just leaving it open-ended about whether he comes back next year or needs more time and then comes back, or if he just wants to step away from the game completely, which I personally, and you know him as much as I do, that he was just born to be a baseball manager. He loves the game so much. And I think he would want to go out on his terms rather than this way. But right now, there's a lot of gray area about what's going to happen over the winter.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about a guy who's had, I mean, the last time I addressed the subject with him, I think he had upward of 18 knee operations, including replacements on both knees, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, he was on a walking boot the 3 months that he managed this year, and you could tell it was really uncomfortable for him. And he finally said, I just got to go get healthy. I can't do this anymore. So, everyone's hopeful, but we'll see, what happens. I don't think we'll know anything for certain probably till the early part of next year.
Yeah, you can bet there's a lot of people praying that he'll be back. He's definitely very loved here.
Yeah.
Gordon, before we sign off today, and I have to say how impressed I am with the knowledge and the history that you have and share about our beloved sports teams. Do you want to share a little bit about your involvement with the Jimmy Fund and the work that's being done?
Thank you so much, Lynn, for giving me that opportunity. And, we were talking about Ted earlier, and Ted, of course, championed the Jimmy Fund and really gave it a visibility that it hadn't enjoyed. It had actually, the Boston Braves were the first team to get involved with the Jimmy Fund. But when the Braves moved to Milwaukee in 1953, the Red Sox stepped in, and Ted made dozens of trips to the Dana-Farber Institute and the Jimmy Fund, to visit with childhood cancer patients. So Jimmy Fund, for those of you, and I know my New Englanders are very familiar with the Jimmy Fund, but for my Ohioans, the Jimmy Fund champions the care and the search for a cure for childhood cancer, and they do extraordinary work. I've had the pleasure and privilege of being part of the telethons that NESN, the New England Sports Network, has done in the past for the Jimmy Fund. I've hosted a couple of events, several events in Chicago, New York, and in Boston to raise money for the Jimmy Fund. And I know, Mr. Ingraham, you're going to have a hard time believing this, but for the 6th consecutive year, I am going to be walking 26.2 miles, the distance of the Boston Marathon, for the Jimmy Fund.
Wow.
So I invite anyone in. I'm so grateful to Kendal at Home is going to make a donation in support of my walk. It's taking place in October, and I invite any of the rest of you, if you're so moved, it's money that's going to a great place. And plus, you get to see a sports rider suffer for 26 miles. What can be better than that?
You can't put a price on that.
That's right. It's priceless, Jim.
Oh, that's great. And thank you for doing that. That is so important. And, all that you do to support that cause. Greatly appreciated. Thank you both so much for being with us today. We are so excited to have had the opportunity to share. And I think Stuart wants us all to know that, he's taking credit for that win in the World Series. So whatever it takes, I hope he can sneak into another one someday here in Cleveland. Or in Boston, it doesn't matter, right?
No, I think, Boston's had 4 since 2004. That's enough. Cleveland's overdue. Stuart, you know what? It's never too old to turn styles, my friend. You're on.
Absolutely.
It's been
Whatever
great.
it takes to make that happen in our lifetime, I think we'd all appreciate it. So no pressure there at all.
Can we get a recording of this?
Yes, absolutely. This will be up on our website, and it's also going to be, you can access it anytime on Kendal at Home's Facebook page as well. So it'll be up live today on the Facebook page, and it will be live probably within a couple days. There will be a recording of it on our Kendal at Home's website as well. And I just want to share with you that after Labor Day on Thursday, September 9th, at 11 a.m., our coffee hour will host Shakers, a gift to be simple, with Tom Daly. And Tom's a return guest of ours, and we're excited to have him come back. And on Friday, September 10th at 11 a.m., 1,000 Years of Music in 1 hour with Maestro Russell Gurr. And we are really excited to welcome both of these guys back. They're becoming regulars on our coffee hours and always entertain our guests and provide a wealth of information. So we hope you'll join us for those. And Jim and Gordon, thank you so much for your time with us today. We so appreciate it. It was a great hour with you. And we look forward to having you back again sometime.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. And nobody's accused either Jim nor I of being maestros, but I want to pay tribute to my friend. He's done an epic job of covering the Indians for 30 years. I always looked forward to coming into the press box to see Mr. Ingraham. He always made me laugh at something, and it was an honor and a privilege to work alongside him. Jim, thank you for making the effort to join us today.
Thank you, Gordy, and thank you for inviting me.
I think you're both a little legends in your own time here in our communities, and we're happy to have you here with us, sharing your knowledge and the history of our beloved baseball team. So thanks so much for your time today, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in September.
Awesome jobs, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Gordy.